little, I'm supposed to be standing here for the mic, so, and the audio, so, but thanks so much for coming, and thanks for having me. This is wonderful. It's a nice venue, and nice warm day and everything. So, I'm pretty open to different forms of interaction, but if you want to jump in with a clarifying question, just go ahead. But if I think we're getting a little off track, maybe I'll bring us back onto track. But there's a lot to deal with in the cognition of climate change, as I call it. So feel free to dive in if something's not clear or there's something burning you can't wait to chat about. Generally, as you see here, it seems like it shouldn't be a counterintuitive notion, but we actually suggest that you can give good science information to people and you can change their minds. For some people, that's actually a kind of a surprising notion. But I'm going to be providing empirical evidence, mostly experimental evidence, to that effect. And there's a website that we're hoping to promote, howglobalwarmingworks.org. And I'll show you a little bit of one of the videos that's on that site. And of course, there are lots of people involved. This is just a bit of them. You can see that there are many, many people, both in Berkeley and elsewhere, that have been very helpful in this project in a lot of varieties of ways. So just to give you a sense of where I'm coming from, the research group, the reasoning group at Berkeley that I head, it sort of has these three intersecting Euler's circles, if you will. We're sort of interested in folks I'll try the laser print here. The science cognition part, as well as mathematical cognition, especially those elements of math cognition that are related to numeracy, people understanding numbers. And then societal importance is a big part of what we're interested in. And if you think about it, there's this triple intersection point, which I think of the sweet spot. And I think of it as climate change cognition, but there's a CCC here as well, so it works both ways. And I think that's a nice place to sort of look at places where science and math and society can come together. So of course, you know, someone who has hair as white as mine, there's a lot that you could talk about. So I have this ambitious outline. We'll see how much we can get through, but if we get through nothing, at least I can give you an outline of what we could have chatted about today. And so one of the background things that sometimes I talk about in other talks that could take a whole session is why the United States is a weird nation. We're sort of an outlier nation in many respects. And we diverge from a lot of other countries. And I'll just have like one slide on this really that I'll buzz through. Because I have this theory called reinforced theistic manifest destiny. And again, I won't spend much time on this other than it sort of historically led us to some of these studies. And the gist of that notion is this grand geopolitical theory is that the United States has been reinforced more than any other country for thinking God is on its side. And there are a lot of data to support this, a bunch of correlations, a bunch of studies we've done, and then some existing data that I developed a theory about. But mostly what I'll be talking about today is this sort of psychology and the public interest sort of approach to climate change cognition, or climate change denial, if you will. And so you'll see a bunch of studies. One of them, a keynote study, is sort of this survey we did in San Diego with almost 300 people. And we'll talk more about our intervention studies. Some of the hallmarks of that include this 400-word description we came up with, just a text that explains how global warming works, the mechanism of global warming. And we've tried it a bunch of places. You can see not only in California, but also in South Texas. We've done MTS samples that are more nationwide in their purview. And we find big increases in knowledge, huge increases, as well as increases in how much people accept global warming and how much concern they have about global warming. And we also find that there's really not much polarization, no polarization really at all in our MTS studies. That is, that it seems like even people on the conservative side of the political spectrum seem to appreciate the information we're providing. And also that there's no stasis. That is, that there's implicitly a theory that's often associated with Dan Kahan that sort of suggests that, well, it's just culture, that climate information or science information really won't change minds. And I think we can pretty much disconfirm that, and have disconfirmed that. So, and then as a part of this, we have developed this sort of direct-to-the-public intervention where we just hoping that 7 billion people will come to this website, understand the mechanism of global warming, go home, they'll change their minds, and they'll get their legislators and so forth to change their minds too. So we're translating it into different languages. We have a full-on video, a set of videos, 5 videos, that we've translated into Mandarin. They have different lengths, the videos. And we're working on at least getting closed captionings for a bunch of other languages, and we've got about 4 of those languages already done. And finally, or toward the final part, you'll see that I'm connecting sort of this mechanistic sort of orientation that was based on RT&D theory with some work I did on numbers, like how to change people's minds just with statistics. And that's a paradigm I call numerically driven inferencing. And you'll see we've actually done 2 of those. We did an evil study where we actually presented misleading, sort of misrepresentative sort of statistics, and then a saintly study where we gave more representative statistics. And we also have this one study that we ran in an 11th grade chemistry classroom where we give them both statistics and the mechanism. So that's pretty much the hope for the game plan. I'll give you a little bit of information just to sort of warrant why the United States that the United States is an odd nation. So here you see one survey in which, in terms of evolution, we were sort of toward the bottom of the list of acceptance between Cyprus and Turkey in this one survey. But it's not just that one. As you'll see, there's a lot of warrant for this. For instance, lots of people think we should teach both evolution and creation, even Berkeley undergrads, even though it's illegal, according to the Supreme Court. The US is very high in its belief in God and the afterlife, compared to peer nations that are secure and relatively wealthy and post-industrial. We've been relatively slow to accept global warming. This is a particularly salient aspect in which it was like we were 25th out of 25 nations in wanting immediate actions. And we also have folks like Senator Inhofe of Oklahoma who calls global warming a hoax and so forth. And we've also noticed that there's a connection between people who deny global warming and deny evolution. Not necessarily Inhofe, I haven't asked him particularly. But indeed, this is just one this is just a sample of like 12 different dimensions in which the United States is just plain weird. We're not like other nations that have the sort of same kind of post-industrial kind of lifestyle we do. So one thing that I've done as someone who studies problem solving is I ask people every so often what they think the world's biggest problem is, because I figure, well, if I'm a problem-solving maven, I should be looking to see where my eyes should be. And indeed, I think today's answer is gravitating toward global warming. Stephen Hawking seems to think it's pretty important. The president of Cornell University came out with that notion. And if it's not clear why it's an obvious answer, part of it's because there's this fear, that the carbon dioxide has gone up to around 400 parts per million in our atmosphere. And I think a lot of people are afraid of ending up like this guy. We're sort of thinking, oh my gosh, I'll be the last one of my species, looking for some food to float by, a little seal meat. And I think there's a lot of motivated reasoning here in terms of social cognition. There's fear involved. We're afraid of our kids. What will happen to the dogs, the redwoods, glaciers, mountains? Where are we going to find stuff to eat? How are we going to power our cars? How am I going to have fun? Where's my retirement going to come from? So there's a lot of concern regarding this, and I think that's why people are sort of worried about it in general. So this is just a little, I'll just briefly show you that I have this grand political theory of why Americans are odd. You can kind of tell from the title, the Reinforced Theistic Manifest Destiny, where it's coming from historically, but generally there's this cluster of 4 concepts over here that tend to cohere with each other, kind of a religious, nationalistic kind of element, the nationalism being both economic and military. And that's in contrast across this connectionist divide with notions that are more sciencey, like evolution and global warming. And if you think about where these things fall out, well, on the ground, this was actually the Red River a couple of years ago, which borders Oklahoma, is on the border of Oklahoma and Texas on the sciencey side. And on the other side, we have Senator Inhofe himself, who ironically, is the senator of the state that had this bone-dry Red River. But this is all I'll be talking about, the geopolitical theory, but if people want, we can dive into the guts of it and its sort of historical bases. I think I'll just skim through this, and the green here are sort of new parts to the theory. But I will point out that we've done a whole bunch of analyses where we've looked at the correlations between those constructs, and they pretty much play out. We've even been doing some experimental work that I won't talk about, in which we actually change one measure, like we increase or decrease people's nationalism and see if that plays out experimentally. But I'd rather just sort of give you an overall sense of the milieu, that there is this sort of agnotology going on, people who are trying to spread false or misleading information. It's the agnotology up there. And there are other things going on besides politics and nationalism, in this sense that stasis may be going on where we just can't change people's minds. There are a lot of people that think we should just teach both controversies, that sort of treat evolution and global warming together as if they're somehow controversies. And it's really the case that there is a sort of political divide, right? So Republicans are a little bit less likely to accept that there's a reason to be worried about global warming than are Democrats. As I mentioned, we found that evolution acceptance is a pretty good predictor of global warming acceptance. And there are a fair amount of vested interests. This is probably not surprising to many of you, but a lot of politicians rely on this money. The Koch brothers, it's alleged, are providing money to these institutions, some of these politicians. But I think the good news is that societies do change, right? There was a time in which people thought the Earth was flat, and or that at least that the sun was revolving around us rather than vice versa. There was a lot of power and influence, the papal power in this case, and that eventually decayed and fell away to the more science normative today. And similarly, the tobacco money and all those folks that wanted to keep smoking, thought it was just fine, that had to give way to a less well-funded but more empirically valid sort of notion of that smoking is not so good for you. So societies can learn, and we're hoping that the same thing will be true with global warming as it was with planets and smoking. And so, but there is this misleading information. I won't go particularly through this or the ethics involved of this sort of advertising, but you've probably seen a number of instances, whether it's commercials for clean coal or something like that, that there's a lot going on. But I'd like to get to the real science, that is the science of global warming per se, and have you ask yourself this question. So some of you may know the answer, some of you may think you know and might be surprised, but I'd like you to think about why the Earth is getting hotter, like what really is the physical or chemical mechanism. And for those of you who haven't thought about this much, I'm going to try to problematize it while I give you some time. So think about how you'd explain how global warming occurs. And you can ruminate on this while I'm problematizing it. One of the questions that often people start fumbling at is the question of why it is that heat has a hard time getting away from the Earth and the troposphere, the atmosphere close to the Earth, but it doesn't have that hard time getting in. Why is there this asymmetry between stuff coming in and stuff getting out? So what I'd like to do now is actually, while you're ruminating on that, play you the video that we have. And this will take a few minutes, but I think it's worth seeing. And this is the hallmark video of our How Global Warming Works website.
You may have heard of global climate change, which is often called global warming. Whether or not people accept that humans are causing global warming, most folks have an opinion about it. But how much do regular people understand the science of climate change? If you were asked to explain how global warming works, could you? Take a moment to try to explain to yourself how virtually all climate scientists think the Earth is warming. What is the physical or chemical mechanism? Don't feel bad. If you're anything like the people we've surveyed in our studies, you probably struggled to come up with an explanation. In fact, in one study, we asked almost 300 adults in the US, and not a single person could accurately explain the mechanism of global warming at a pretty basic level. This is consistent with larger surveys that have shown that people often lack knowledge about climate change. But how can we make informed decisions without understanding the issues we're debating? Allow us to give you a short explanation of how global warming works. First, here is how Earth's temperature works without considering how humans influence it. The Earth absorbs light from the sun, which is mostly visible light. To release that light energy, Earth also emits light. But because the Earth is cooler than the sun, it emits lower energy infrared light. So, Earth's surface essentially transforms most of the visible light it gets from the sun into infrared light. Greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, such as methane and carbon dioxide, let visible light pass through but absorb infrared light, causing the atmosphere to retain heat. This energy can be absorbed and emitted by the atmosphere many times before it eventually returns to outer space. The added time this energy hangs around has helped keep Earth warm enough to support life as we know it. Without this greenhouse effect, caused by these greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, the Earth's average surface temperature would be about 50 degrees Fahrenheit cooler, which is well below the freezing point for ice. So, how have humans changed things? Since the dawn of the industrial age, around the year 1750, atmospheric carbon dioxide has increased by 40%, and methane has almost tripled. These increases cause extra infrared light absorption, meaning an extra greenhouse effect, which has caused Earth to heat above its typical temperature range. In other words, energy that gets to Earth has an even harder time leaving it, causing Earth's average temperature to increase, thus producing global climate change. In case you're wondering about what makes greenhouse gases special, here are 2 sentences of slightly technical information. Greenhouse gases, such as carbon dioxide, absorb infrared light because their molecules can vibrate to produce asymmetric distributions of electric charge, which match the energy levels of various infrared wavelengths. In contrast, non-greenhouse gases, such as oxygen, that is O2, don't absorb infrared light because they have symmetric charge distributions even while vibrating. To wrap up, we'll quickly summarize the mechanism of global climate change. Earth transforms sunlight's visible energy into infrared light, and infrared energy leaves Earth slowly because it's absorbed by greenhouse gases. As people produce more greenhouse gases, energy leaves Earth even more slowly, raising Earth's temperature even more than it has already gone up. That's how global warming happens. This wasn't so hard to understand, right? In these few minutes, you've hopefully become one of the few people who understand the mechanism of global climate change. Please share this video with others so you can help them understand how global warming works too. Thanks for listening.
So I let this run a little longer than I usually do just because I think there's some interesting cognitive science in there when you think about like elements of persuasion as well as like beyond the psycholinguistics or even perceptual kind of elements. Maybe just to make it clear, we actually have this in Mandarin too, and I'll just play a couple seconds as an existence proof. As we sweat bullets to make it.
把来自太阳的可见光转化成红外光。由于温室气体能够吸收大量的红外光，所以这些能量只能很缓慢地离开地球。
Well, that's enough of that. Does anyone speak Mandarin here? Did that sound okay? All right. I'll take that as wild encouragement. But I'll go back to this. I mean, I can tell you that what's interesting about this is that it's, I think, a relatively simple message, but as you'll see empirically, most people just don't have a sense of this. And the thing that we're problematizing here to some degree, many people have this model that light bounces off the Earth and heads back out, and then it's grabbed by the greenhouse gases, but it doesn't address some important things because they're missing that notion of absorption and emission of different kinds of light. So otherwise, well, how do these atmospheric molecules know which way is up or which way is down? Why wouldn't it just bounce off the top of the atmosphere? So there are lots of reasons that people think they know this, the answer to this, and they don't. And they often don't know about the greenhouse gases. Those like extra 2 sentences of what makes something a greenhouse gas helps sort of reify it to some degree. But you don't might think that, well, certainly experts know this, right? Well, it turns out I was talking with a 6th-year environmental sciences graduate student, and I asked him to explain it to me. He could not. And then I explained it to him, and he said, wow, I guess I don't know the right answer. And it turns out the person is not alone. I was having lunch a few years back with someone who was very upset when he realized he didn't know the answer. I explained it to him. He was really upset he didn't know it. I said, don't beat yourself up. And he said, it's not all right that I didn't know. You don't understand. I've published papers about global warming. In fact, I can tell you that I had dinner with one of the most cited climate change communicators in the world, and that person did not know the mechanism of global warming either. So, and here's yet one example. This is someone from at UCSD, the Scripps Institute, used to work there. This person had a misconception that the ozone layer, what was going on, seemed to think that the greenhouse effect was caused by humans. It's not quite true. Global warming is kind of like an extra greenhouse effect, but there was a greenhouse effect before we existed. So it's not, I thought, well, gee, maybe it's just, my buddies and academics who don't know this. So we went to San Diego, and sure enough, as you kind of get a sense in the video, we asked them this mechanistic question, and most people had ozone as like a misconception. They thought that was a major cause of global warming. Only about 12% had any sort of notion of trapping heat that they could explicate. Only 3% mentioned the greenhouse effect as a player, and 0, not a single person, could do what I think you can say in like 35 words, like 35-word summary in our video people couldn't come up with. You might think, oh, well, you're probably asking them for technical information. We wouldn't even have required them to use the word infrared, which is fine because 0% of them mentioned infrared anyway. So it turns out that basically people don't know this. And we've got similar results from 11th grade chemistry students, all the other surveys we've done. And I just thought, well, this is very odd, why journalists and instructors aren't informing us of this. Actually, at the last American Geophysical Union, there was a paper that indicated that people who teach global warming at universities have barely a better model than the students that they're explaining it to. So it's really difficult. This mechanistic thing is not as easy as you might think. And it turns out that we found empirically that global warming acceptance is actually linked to mechanistic knowledge. So the more you know about it, the more you accept it. This has now been just replicated. Only days ago I got an email that this other group in Germany has replicated that using our materials. And this conflicts directly with the stasis view that sort of suggests that it doesn't matter how much science you know, and part of it's because those folks are measuring not the right thing about science. They're not specifically looking at the mechanism. Here's a quote by Dan Kahan, which indicated that efforts to promote scientific literacy can't be expected to dissipate public conflict over climate change. And as you'll see, that sort of stasis view, I think, falls away. And it's not as if the San Diegans were denying global warming. Many of them accepted it. Most of them strongly agreed that it's occurring, and more than half of them agreed that human activities are a significant cause, which is a little disturbing in itself. That means that if someone who accepts global warming is trying to convince someone else in a bar about why they don't have the materials that they could, they say, oh, tell me how it happens. And people draw a blank, right? So this is not great pedagogy. We thought, well, why don't we just tell people what's going on and see if that changes things? So we ran this experiment, and it turns out, maybe I'll show you a little background to this first. It turns out just empirically, a lot of people think they know the mechanism, but don't, and they don't see it as a threat. So here the United States is a little overconfident in how much they think they know about global warming. Unfortunately, they're not as oriented toward changing things or seriously worried about it, maybe a little bit more than the world, but less so than most industrialized nations. That's just sort of background for base rates. So what we did is we ran this study in which we basically just blurted out in 400 words the mechanism of global warming. And it's an experiment I call the sandwich experiment. And you'll see why it has a sort of a jam sandwich where we ask people what they think, we give them our 400 words, and then we ask them what they think. And it's sort of like the bread is the pre and a post test, and this 400 words represents the jam in the experiment. And of course, we're trying to assess this hypothesis, and maybe it's ignorance that explains this reluctance to accept climate change. So since it's a causal question, it's a good time for an experiment. And here's the design in our sandwich group. You can see we assessed their knowledge and attitude. We gave them the description and tested them again. And you're probably thinking, oh, well, that's a lot of experiment on demand. So we actually ran a control group with no pre-test to address that as well. So what happened? Well, we ran two groups, one at Berkeley and one at University of Texas at Brownsville. And UT Brownsville is about 96% Mexican American, as I understand it. And so we thought, well, what do they know? And we were scoring very generously. and on 3 different dimensions, whether they understood the light was different coming in as going out, if they understood greenhouse gases, if they understood some of the energy dynamics. And we scored them, if they just gave us, if they just mentioned it, we'd give them 1 out of 3 points, so they get 33%. But you can see their knowledge on these dimensions was pretty modest. So what happened when we gave them the 400 words? Well, you'll see that there was a non-trivial increase. Indeed, we got sort of a doubling or a tripling overall. The Brownsville students are actually getting close to quadrupling, even though they were like in geology classes. So they weren't, sort of anthropology majors that were unassociated with science. I shouldn't put it that way. Unassociated with earth science. Strike that from the record. So, and one of the interesting things here is that knowledge does correlate with accepting global warming, both as occurring and as anthropogenic, as we found in our San Diego and other data. And again, this contrasts with the sort of stasis view, which we think is disconfirmed. But the best thing about this was it also changed people's acceptance of global warming. It's not just that their understanding boosted, but if you look to see where they started in terms of their acceptance of global warming, where they ended up, they increased both at Berkeley and Brownsville, and the p-values were satisfying for us. So we showed not only is learning possible, which is always good, but also that attitude change is possible as well. And that sort of attitude change means people are more likely accepting of global warming. So that is good news. It worked with heliocentrism and the smoking cancer link. It looks like it can work with global warming as well. And it also had some sort of potential boots on the ground in terms of their willingness to sacrifice. And we found even most recently in Germany, some new data indicate that this knowledge and acceptance correlates with environmental attitudes and behaviors. Of course, intention to act isn't always action, but at least it's a place to start, right? So we've also looked at longevities, because you might think, oh, how long can 400 words last? But indeed, we've been looking to see how much these studies are durable. And so we've been looking at like 5.5 days for our MTurk studies. And in the high school classroom, after like a 45-minute curriculum, we tested them over a month later, and we still had good utility for that. So it seems like it's got some stickability as well. And as you'll see later, not only does this contrast with stasis theory, but also with his notion of polarization. I'll have a particular slide about that. Well, these are just slides about the physics and all. But one interesting thing, just to give you a sense of the parameterization, is that greenhouse gases are so good at grabbing photons of infrared that only 1 out of every 10 photons that get shot off, like the asphalt outside, make it to outer space unimpeded. 90% of them get caught and sort of percolated around until that energy gets out. So it gives you a little bit, I call it the Goldilocks tithing, since it's a 10% thing, but much of that is in the video, so I'll skip through it. So the polarization question is that, like, yeah, but people believe what they want to believe. If you show this to conservatives, they will just reject it. Well, that's not what happened when we looked at this MTurk study with the 5.5 degree delay. So you can see here, this is a correlation line, and you can see that it's basically flat. It almost looks like a line at 0 point, but it's actually positive, but basically flat. So the correlation here is basically 0, minus 0.03. That's lower than the correlation that would be useful if you were trying to figure out if you were female and if you were lesbian by measuring your finger length. That, you get like a 0.1 correlation out of those subtle measures. So this is a really tiny effect. So if there is any polarization, it's pretty tiny. Not only that, you'd expect polarization, meaning that we'd have a lot of conservatives down here, and we only have 1 down here and like 5 above there. So we certainly don't have any evidence that people are like rejecting this as propaganda and saying, oh, now I even accept global warming less, which is technically what polarization is about. And you can see that they're in the positive realm even for Republicans and Democrats in terms of moving in the direction of the information in that mechanistic explanation. And this is the kind of thing we'd hope that citizens would be able to talk about. This is actually our 400 words where we have like a shorter summary as a kicker down on the bottom. And then this is the inner part where we have two main statistics, the increases in the 2 different classes. And it sort of begs the question, which part of this science do people like James Inhofe or Rick Perry not accept? I mean, it's pretty straightforward science, right? So one of the things we think that's going on psychologically is surprise. And I'll blow through this because this is really sort of related to a more extensive kind of talk. But we think surprising is pretty important. And also we're finding that these relationships between those 6 constructs are still playing out the way that was predicted. But I want to move now toward another of the sort of pincer movement we have in terms of addressing kind of denial of global warming. On the one hand, there's mechanistic sorts of understandings. But on the other hand, there's sort of an evidential side. And you usually see more of this in the media, right, where the sea levels are rising or ice is melting and so forth. But one of the things that I think is sometimes missed in that is just pure power of statistics. So there's this other line of research that I've been engaged in called numerically driven inferencing. And in the past, we've looked at topics like abortion or immigration and so forth. And I've worked with journalists and trying to get them to be more understanding of numbers. I won't belabor this with respect to what we did with the journalists. But one of the things that we thought might be interesting is we just gave statistics to people that seemed like they might be poignant and see if that had any effect on them. So we asked them to estimate first, and then we give them a statistic. So here's an example. Of course, you just saw this one, so hopefully you might remember from the video what the answer is. But let's say that you weren't so sure that global warming was happening. You might think, well, maybe the concentration of methane has barely been changing, I guess 5%. Well, you can imagine how surprised they'd be if they find out that it's getting near tripling, that it's over 150%. It might even be that they'd be more willing to allocate money for ameliorating global warming or retarding it. Here's another question. You can actually try this one out. So this is a question we pose people, what's the increase or decrease in temperature? What's been the change of global temperature between 1940 and 1975, according to NOAA? So just by show of hands, how many people think that it's gone down, that it went down in this period, we decreased? How many people think it went up? Okay, more hands. Well, it turns out it actually went down. So there's this one little period, about 35 years, where whether it's because of Milankovitch cycles or poor measurements that weren't particularly representative, there was this little tiny bit in which we sort of hit a plateau. And this is a very tiny decrease, right? Especially if you think about a Kelvin scale, 0.2 degrees Fahrenheit is tiny. But we thought, well, this would be interesting to use too. And so we use these in our evil study. So this is one of the evil statistics that you might find ne'er-do-wells sort of cherry picking and providing to people. So we ran a study with these evil numbers. And for one, we again used a sort of a sandwich version. We just gave them 2 statistics. In this other version, we gave them 8 statistics. So we had sort of 2 different dosages. And we thought, well, what would happen if we just gave these statistics that I would never want to mention in public? And indeed, it turns out that they do a number on people. So these are Berkeley data. So you can see we started off at 6.5 in terms of the overall acceptance that global warming is occurring. And with 2 items, it dropped down to 6.2. And with 8, it dropped down to 5.9, which seems like a pretty big effect, just seeing 8 statistics. But even more notable, it really did a number on their self-confidence. So when they rated their self-knowledge, initially they were right at the midpoint of the scale. On a 9-point scale, they were right at 5.0. After 2, they dropped down to 4.5. After 8, they dropped down to 2.9. So just by showing them 8 statistics, they lost more than half of the confidence they had going in. And all these were reliable. But again, even with this study, we didn't find polarization. So you might find that the liberals would say, oh, this is propaganda. This is going to make me accept global warming even more. And that was not the case. We got no correlation, very tiny. In fact, it was in the opposite direction than you would expect if polarization were actually going on. And again, 0.009, if you square that to find a proportion of variance, it's tiny. But fortunately, we have seeming numbers too. We ran a study with that, and these are some examples. So this is what's called the climate consensus kind of item, where it asks, how many of the climatologists do you think agree that humans are causing it? Here's one about, how many of the past dozen years have been the hottest. Here's the one you saw in the video, the 40% increase in carbon dioxide. A lot of these were sort of selected from or inspired by this list of numbers I gave to the journalists, my list of 40 numbers that everyone should know, but most people don't, sort of the environmental version. And indeed, we found in our latest study that these actually do increase people's acceptance in global warming. That is, just giving these 7 statistics to people, having them estimate them, and then having them receive the feedback. Even in a more nationally representative MTS study, causes people to increase their acceptance of global warming. And again, with no polarization. Again, the R is so tiny that it's basically 0. You can see wildly far away from being significant. So again, it's not like the conservatives were saying, oh, this is propaganda. I hate these statistics. You're lying to me. Now I accept global warming even less. So we didn't find that. So what we did basically is, let me check the time. We thought, well, this is almost like finding a cure to cancer. We can't just sit on this. We have to get this out to the public. So what we decided to do was to avoid the middle people of instructors and journalists and just generate this website that basically made the videos of the sort you saw. So it explains the mechanism. It avoids the middle people of clearly empirically shown suboptimal instructors and journalists. And we want to make the mechanism of global warming like round world evident. And by that I mean that we can no longer elect legislators who think the world is flat. And it would be nice if we could get to a point where we could no longer elect legislators who think that global warming is a hoax. And so I'm hoping you'll go to this link. I was telling someone just earlier that the main graduate student I was working on with this, I said, I'll be happy if we only have like 1,000 people going to this if we have 1,000 people going to this in the first year. Well, we announced this like 9 months ago, and we already have over 125,000 page views. They're looking at the videos on our site. Not only that, they're coming from around the world, 200 countries, about 10,000 towns. But even more, people are writing about this. So from one NPR blog alone, 100,000 people read this blog posting just about our work. So people are reading about our videos, they're hearing summaries of the 400 words and so forth. So we think that's pretty exciting, especially given that we announced it just before the polar vortex occurred on the East Coast. So that we thought that was pretty good. And we've now added the 7 saintly numbers, so that if you go to the website, you can go up and click on our saintly numbers. Not putting the evil ones up yet. Not sure if I will. But we're also analyzing the data from coming into our site, and we're comparing like the comments we're getting, and not only that, but we're comparing comments we're getting who are mostly saying, wow, this is great, thanks, or they'll try to offer a suggestion or a comment that's helpful. We get very few deniers, maybe 2 or 3% who are contacting us. But what's interesting is they send us comments directly. We don't allow these public comments. But if you look at other sites, like npr.org, there are lots of people that are denying, which suggests to me that maybe some of these people are paid. I'm not saying it's necessarily the case, but it's interesting, the vast discrepancy between the kinds of deniers you see on the public commenting sites versus ours is really striking. And we're also looking at the comments we're getting from China. Yes, there are climate deniers even in China, as it turns out, but not that many of them. This slightly old version of what our website looks like at the upper right now, you'll find our 7 statistics up around here. But you can see we give people a choice of 5 different videos. So if you have an aunt who only has the attention span of like a cat video, then send her the 52-second video. And if you have like someone who thinks might be using this in their curriculum for a high school class, then maybe the 5-minute version would be useful. And we've got various languages in here that you can look at, different ways to share it. In fact, some of the features of this 5-minute version, and we try to design this with good cognitive science principles in mind. So usually what we try to do is ask people to generate an explanation for themselves, because we find generally that if you just tell people what the mechanism is, they have this hindsight bias. Well, they'll say, yeah, I think that's what I'd say. Really, only 0% of people can say that. You think you're among the 0.003%? We also are making explicit with basically secret knowledge. We make it clear that nobody knows this. And there are 2 main conceptual changes that we think people are going through when they are watching and understanding the video. The one is that there's different light coming in and going out, and that's the crucial part that many people miss. And the other part is that global warming is essentially an extra greenhouse effect. It's an unnatural, human-caused greenhouse effect. This was particularly hard for our 11th grade chemistry students to wrap their heads around. We just give a little bit of evidence, just 2 statistics embedded in them. And we put in those 2 technical sentences in there, partly to show that there's a lot more science behind this. And believe me, I've had to learn so much about this little realm of climate science that sometimes my ears are about to bleed. And so there are many layers that you could go into. We even get comments from people who think that we got the science wrong, and then I have to explain to them why it's not wrong. So if you share this link, that'd be great. But wait, there's more. It's like a Ginzu kitchen knife commercial, right? So how much would you pay for a Mandarin version? Well, as you see, we have a Mandarin version. We're trying to go international. And a number of people have been helping us come up with translations. If you know a language that we haven't gotten to yet, we'd love to have you help us translate it. And there are some technical and even political problems, like China doesn't allow YouTube, so we had to generate these on a site called Youku. And then they have different sharing mechanisms. They don't allow Twitter or Facebook, so we have to do Renren, Weibo, and things like that. So it's interesting, besides the psycholinguistics of trying to get across the semantics crisply is sort of interesting. And we've put up good translations up so that if you go to closed captioning, you can get good translations. For other languages, like 71 other languages, you can get Google Translate quality if you want Armenian or Azerbaijan or something like that. We haven't gotten to those yet. But you can at least get the idea, even with Google Translate's closed captions. So we have, so far, we have Japanese and German and traditional Chinese, Russian and Spanish are imminent, Thai and French hopefully soon. We got Hindi started, and we're looking at Vietnamese, Italian, maybe Portuguese. So if you have any help, we'd certainly love help with Arabic. As I mentioned, the Hindi we're sort of getting going. And our modest goal is to get 7 billion people to see this, right? So literally, imagine if everyone on the planet went to this website, saw it, came to understand the mechanism, and accepted it more, even if it's just a little bit more, that would not be a bad thing, right? Because we kind of think that although it's great to act locally and recycle and everything, and that's a wonderful thing and very helpful all in all, that it'd be nice if all the legislatures and all the countries could get together and have an international agreement, because I think that's where a lot of action will be coming from, even though the local stuff is quite important as well. So we're trying to get people to send their videos to folks. This is what the Chinese web page looked like at least a couple months ago. So you can see we actually translated because of this YouTube kind of thing, so that people can actually see this. And we may well be translating other full-on pages into other languages as well. So I'll dive into the conclusions, and we can see what discussion there is. Basically, I've sort of highlighted the ones that are most salient in green, so as not to bore you too much. But one thing I'll point out is that this sort of, my little geopolitical theory, if anything, at least suggested this sort of apparently counterintuitive notion that you can actually inform folks by giving them good science information, which has turned out to be successful now. We found that the global warming acceptance is correlated with both knowledge about global warming and willingness to sacrifice, and that's been replicated now both here in Germany. And it turns out that folks rarely know the global warming mechanism. So if you did know this before the video, good on you, congratulations. Probably more of you thought you might have known it than you did. And it turns out that people can learn it relatively quickly. It's 400 words. And you might think, well, gee, what if they forget it? And I say, well, that's okay too, right? So I don't know how many people in this room could actually, right now on demand, generate a proof for the Pythagorean theorem. I'm not sure how long it would take me to do that, but I believe in the Pythagorean theorem even though I can't derive it right now, because there was a point in my life when I derived it, I saw others derive it, and I know that it's true even if I can't in the moment do that. And we're hoping that that'll be an element of our change as well, that even if you can't reproduce the dance between infrared and visible and whatnot, you'll say, I saw a video, I knew then that it was true, and I'm telling you, go see the video. So hopefully that's something that can happen. And we've seen this gain in the climate change acceptance. Also, another thing to highlight is that we think this surprise mechanism where you get people to estimate something or come up with their own explanation for the mechanism, then you give them the information, that surprise, the difference between what they can generate and what they maybe can just recognize later is important in generating these cognitive changes. We can shift people both saintly and evil, as it turns out, with numbers that are representative or cherry-picked. It turns out that obviously you can move people up and down with surprise. We've addressed, at least to some degree, the longevity question, so it's not like this is just a transient femtosecond kind of change in people's minds and it just flitters out of their brains immediately. we're sort of, if you think of the field of dreams adage, if you build it, they will come. We're hoping if you build their understanding, they'll come to accept it. And I think you can see by the end of this that the stasis theory is pretty much disconfirmed. We have a number of experiments now that show that change is possible. And we have found zero evidence for polarization either in the 3 studies I presented here. So there are 7 billion folks, right? They need help from scientists, like cognitive scientists, and physical scientists as well, right? We're hoping that global warming, how global warming works, will be part of that. We've got it in other languages. And again, what we're hoping to is to help society and the planet in general get to sort of a tipping point where many nations can, realize, oh, this is time for us to have an international agreement. So I've gone on probably longer than I needed to, so I'll just thank you.